York, the jewel of the north, situated just below the Yorkshire moors and the dales. An ancient city. These days, it's more famous for ghosts, stag nights, and flat caps. But under your feet is a rich history, full of Vikings, Romans, and knights. So, let's get stuck into the history of York. As we know, despite having a civil war that resulted in the end of the monarchy, Oliver Cromwell only ruled for 10 years as Lord Protector, eventually leaving his son in charge, Richard Cromwell. But he wanted none of it, so handed the reins back to Charles II, who took over as king. The monarchy was restored, and York was about to enter a prosperous period once again. One of Yorkshire's most prominent figures was Thomas Fairfax. He was Yorkshire born and bred, born in Denton near Leeds. He's the man who commanded the New Model Army back in the war, that's the Parliamentarian Army, and was a powerful figure back during the interregnum, the period under Cromwell where England had no king and the heir was in exile having fled the country. And now, during this restoration, Thomas Fairfax had entered retirement in nearby Nunn Appleton, just south of York. Despite his prior reputation as a rebel commander, he has proven his worth during the Restoration and suffered no retribution from the new wave of royalists. He also dealt with the problem that currently resided with York Castle, also known as Clifford Tower, as by now the waters of ownership were pretty murky. For a start, the old Motte and Bailey are now pretty much two separate entities. You've got the Tower, which holds the military garrison, including all the gunpowder. Opposite, you've got the Bailey, which has been used as an old prison dating back centuries. There was also problems with the moat, problems going quite far back, and another attempt to restore it was underway. And Clifford's Tower wasn't a new fortification. It was built way back in the mid-13th century. It's already been deemed unsafe by various people as far back as Richard III. You're probably wondering why I refer to it as Clifford's Tower and York Castle. Why the two names? Well, it's not just because some rich bloke named Clifford just happened to buy the castle from another rich family. He's a Clifford, from the Clifford noble family. The Cliffords had owned the castle way back in the high medieval age, only losing it during the Despencer War when Roger rebelled against Edward II. Roger Clifford was hanged by the neck in York in 1322, and the Cliffords had only relatively recently acquired the castle back. But now, Henry Clifford himself had died in 1643 with no heir. Once again, the castle leaves the Cliffords and ends up back in the hands of one of the previous owners. As to who, I do not know. The bugger is, it's still a military garrison paid by the people of the city, so the new owners now have a castle they can't even use. But elsewhere, buildings are changing. We're well into the Baroque period by now, and York embraces the art and architecture that is sweeping across Europe. The city is slowly beginning to resemble the York we know today, as it sheds the old for the new. Streets like the Collegate, Saviourgate, Shambles and Pavement. Old streets, familiar in medieval times, they are still around after all these years, after all these centuries. But not everyone wants to live in Yorkshire, and there are always some who head down to London. Such as a scallywag from West Riding, who did just that. John Neveson ran away as a young teenager, arriving in the capital and ending up serving in the military. He was never a good kid. After fighting abroad, he returned to England with a few like-minded individuals who took up a life of crime. During the 1660s, he's in Kent giving it proper Harry the Pickle, proper naughty. A highwayman, making a name for himself, robbing the rich. He was connected with some really dodgy geezers. John Neveson was known as a gentleman highwayman. He was the stereotypical masked rogue, a polite, dashing figure who only robbed the rich before retreating to a safe house, a pub in Newark. His luck ran out in 1676 when he robbed a random traveller. By now he's followed a decade-long career as a highwayman and was already under serious investigation. All he needs is a solid alibi. But all his accomplices are also under investigation, and the authorities are well aware of that pub in Newark. And some have already swung by the neck or been in prison. So John Neveson does something rather daring. He cannot be in two places at the same time, assuming he is swift enough. So once he flees Kent to London, crossing the Thames, he makes his famous 200-mile ride to York. Neveson made the whole journey in a single day, arriving just before sunset, later earning the name Swift Nick. Once there, he had to be seen to solidify his alibi. He seeks out the Lord Mayor in York and ends up betting a wager on a bowls match. So when his inevitable trial came up, the Lord Mayor vouched for him. No sensible person could imagine a 200-mile ride. The only logical possibility is Neveson was already in York at the time of the robbery. He is found not guilty. But like any career criminal, he could not keep his nose clean, and the very next year he steals a horse and is caught. This time, Swift Nick could provide no alibi. He is tried and convicted. Guess what castle bailey he was sent to? You guessed it, the bailey at Clifford Tower. Chances of that. In 1681, after a few years in prison, he was sent to be transported to Tangier, after dobbing in his accomplices. But once again he couldn't help himself, and he jumped ship, vanishing up north. A search began, where the usually non-violent Swift Nick murdered a constable who tried to arrest him. Now he was not facing prison, but the Tyburn jig. And then, in 1684, after a 3-year manhunt and a 20-quid reward, he was found at a pub in Wakefield. Taken back to York, he was tried again and convicted. And this time, instead of Clifford Tower, he was sent to Knavesmire, where the gallows and noose awaited. And Swift Nick, John Neveson, was hanged. And he danced his last jig. He was buried at St. Mary's Church in an unmarked grave. And he would not be the last famous highwayman to have connections with York. But aside from him, York is doing very well as a city. We're in the age of Enlightenment, and you've got people like Francis Place to talk about. He's a famous artist living around this time. He's not a Yorkshireman, he's from Durham, further up. Yes, there is something further than Yorkshire. But is heavily connected with York due to his work. He did many things: pottery, engravings, he did artistic prints, but was mostly a draftsman, a chap that draws detailed drawings of works such as architecture and machinery. He's also another member of the Gray's Inn, like Robert Ascii all those years back. And there was another artist and engraver, William Lodge. He and Place were both friends, and they worked in the same circles with all the other artists, including Henry Giles, a glass painter. They operated a salon in York, and they seemed to be doing pretty well. That was until 1678, when a Protestant priest named Titus Oates decided to commit his infamous lie, the popish plot. He's basically invented a conspiracy theory that blamed Catholics for a dastardly plan to assassinate King Charles II, a wicked fabrication that caused panic and led to the death of a Protestant magistrate. Of course, Titus Oates pinned the blame on the Catholics. This led to many people being punished. Many were tortured, hanged, and the two aforementioned artists are no exception to this panic. On a peaceful trip to Wales, Lodge and Place were accused of being Catholic spies, part of this Jesuit conspiracy to murder the king. They find themselves in prison, though thankfully not for long, as they were released. But returning back to York, Francis Place seems to have become a painter, being a dab hand with oil and canvas. But not much of his works survive, I'm afraid, and the atrophy of time claimed all but a few. As for the popish plot, it will claim another resident of York, a Nicholas Postgate, a Catholic priest who spent his time travelling around between the scattered pockets of Jesuits who lived around the Yorkshire moors. He quickly falls victim to Titus Oates' evil accusations, arrested during a baptism. It was a kangaroo trial, more fixed than the WWE. He is convicted by the same laws that condemned Margaret Clitheroe during the Elizabethan period, the Jesuit Act of 1584. And like Clitheroe, Nicholas Postgate is also sentenced to a gruesome death. And like Swift Nick, he is taken to Knavesmire to meet his tragic fate. His punishment? Hung, drawn and quartered. I say hung, not hanged, because the hanging isn't fatal. That's not the punishment, that's just the beginning. And unlike Guy Fawkes, poor old Postgate doesn't cheat his fate. Well, once hung until near death, his guts are then pulled out while he's alive. Yeah, I don't need to explain all the gory details. It's pretty much the same fate as William Wallace all those centuries ago, although I strongly advise against watching Braveheart, as it is about as accurate as a bow with a rubber string. King Edward was not pagan, Isabella of France was round 7, so unless William Wallace had a shell suit and a blonde wig and a cigar, he didn't have a relationship with her, and they never met. Anyway, I could whinge for hours, days even, so I will cease. While on the scaffold, prior to the execution, Nicholas Postgate simply tells the crowd that he was too old for speeches, merely reminding them that he'll die for his Catholic faith. And that he did. He suffered a horrible fate, even worse than suffering the horrors of watching a Braveheart movie. In 1987, Pope Paul II would give him beatification. No, not Braveheart, Postgate. This was held in Rome, putting his soul at rest and on the path to sainthood. He is one of the 85 martyrs of England and Wales who fell foul of the Jesuit Act of 1584. As for Titus Oates, the conductor of this despicable plot, well, he was forced to give up his residence in Whitehall, London. He is slung in prison and slapped with a fine of £100,000, a massive amount of money. Eventually, he'll be retried, stripped of his clerical status, put on public display in a pillory, and whipped all the way to Tyburn in London, although not to hang. And once again he'll be slung in prison, this time for perjury. He's a shame to mankind. He probably wished he'd swung. The archaic, crumbling mess that was Clifford Tower was suggested for repairs, but never got them due to the considerable expense that it would cost. Though the Bailey did see some renovations, with the additions of a common hall and a jury house. This was very much the centre of the Crown Courts of York, with anyone convicted in the criminal court sent to the prison next door. And then, in 1684, on April the 23rd, which is St George's Day by the way, there was a disaster at Clifford Tower. As the gunpowder I mentioned earlier that's being stored in the garrison ignited, causing a massive explosion, ripping the already old wood apart and gutting the interior. It was a miracle no one was hurt. Yeah, no one was hurt. Not a sausage. All the gunpowder tore apart the wooden structures of the Shell Keep, and no one even got a splinter? Very suspicious if you ask me. And then it turns out that some of the soldiers had moved their equipment out of the castle before the explosion, and no one was inside at all. Highly suspicious, although no one was punished. Accidents happen after all. And the military abandon the wrecked tower, which is handed back to the owners I mentioned earlier. Here you go, have a useless, ruined castle, enjoy. And the next year, when King Charles II dies in 1685, having no legitimate heirs, he hands the throne down to his Catholic brother, the Duke of York, James II. Though his only connection to York is his title, I just thought I'd mention it to complete the passage of time. And his reign won't last long, just 3 years, before the usual Catholic-Protestant arguments erupted. You see, James II was Catholic, and it soon became apparent he wasn't his brother, Charles. And to top this off, he's undoing years of Protestant reforms, like allowing a convent to be built in York, the Bar Convent, which is the oldest convent in England. But the cherry on top is he's now got a new Catholic heir to the throne. Yes, he's got a son. So a cabal of 7 Protestant nobles, 1 bishop, and the rest were made up of both Tory and Whig parties, and they invited the king's daughter, Mary, to take the throne, along with her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Now, I will warn that occasionally there will be hints of what can be classed as modern political ideologies. There will be mention of Tories, MPs, and William of Orange himself is highly controversial, especially for many Irish. But I will remain strictly impartial, and only mention it in context of historicity. Either way, I'll give the gist here, and keep it to the region of York or when it matters historically, as I do plan on covering other cities, and they'll play their own part in the overall timeline as the channel progresses. As for Whigs and Tories, in a nutshell it goes like this. Tories support King James being heir, regardless of his Catholicism. Whigs don't. They would rather the throne skip James and be passed on to Mary, as she's a Protestant. Later, these politics will evolve, but currently it's where we stand. And on the brink of war, everyone's pretty wigged out. James fears a Dutch invasion and begins preparation. He meets varying degrees of success, with many people supporting the possibility of a Protestant king and queen, once James has been given a shoeing at least. Up in Yorkshire, you have Henry Bellesis, a Protestant military commander. He's a Whig, a supporter of the Dutch invasion. He marches towards York, intent on capturing it, for the Protestant cause. The problem is, the governor of York is the MP for the city of York, Sir John Reresby, 2nd Baronet, a staunch Tory and supporter of King James. He's known as the King's Man in York, though his faith is a little bit lacking as of late. He's a Yorkshireman through and through. And do you remember that house that Henry VIII made the seat of the Council of the North? The one owned by the monks, but sort of got repurposed post the dissolution of the monasteries. King's Manor. Well, it is currently owned by this chap. Now, enter Thomas Osborne, Duke of Leeds and the Earl of Danby. He's a staunch Whig. He marches on to York and quickly seizes the castle. But remember, there's no garrison there at this point in time. He doesn't need one. He has Sir Reresby arrested in his home and slings him in prison at the castle, in the debtor's prison. This is an elected MP, slung in with the rabble. Danby is not mucking about. Soon Yorkshire is secured. It's all kicking off. In the meantime, William of Orange invades England at the head of a Dutch fleet of 200 ships. People are deserting James, abandoning the king and flocking to William's banner. Even Princess Anne turned her back on her father, joining the Dutch commander. But James doesn't fight. He knows he doesn't stand a chance, and flees for France. Hence, it's known as a bloodless revolution. Yeah, their words, not mine. Now, his daughter Mary, and her husband William, ruled the British Empire. And I'm pretty sure it's the first time we've had a Dutch ruler since Matilda of Flanders. James will be a pickle from time to time, but that's not relevant to the history of York. As for poor old Sir Reresby, he is released once Mary and William take the throne, and he enters retirement in London. There is nothing for him here, and he dies only a year later in London. He was only 55, though he is buried up in Yorkshire. As for his house, King's Manor, the Earl of Danby now controls it, and he lets it out to private residents for a good few years. And guess who one of these residents was? Francis Place, the artist from earlier. He's renting the manor. So he's certainly doing well for himself in the late 1680s. There you go. As the 17th century drew to a close, Queen Mary contracted smallpox and passed away at the young age of 32, and the crown was passed to her husband, William of Orange, now William III, though even he would only reign until 1702, leaving Queen Anne as the ruler of the empire. Queen Anne was cursed to have no children that would make it through childhood. The poor woman had a long line of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. One baby lived just long enough to be baptized before passing. The eldest was 11. Soon to follow was her husband, George of Denmark. Anne was on her own, and would herself die just before she was 50, leaving the throne to pass to the Hanoverians. Anne's second cousin, George I. So here we are in 1714, and York is about to undergo some more changes during this new Georgian era. By now the ancient prison is deemed unsafe, and the recently built courthouses are already crumbling due to neglect. So the dilapidated structures are pulled down and rebuilt using stone from an old abbey that once stood, St. Mary's. And these buildings still stand today, in one form or another, though they didn't have that carousel. The actual main building around this area sort of stops around the 1770s, so we've still got a while to go till it's all completed, but we'll get there. The distinctive look of the Georgian era can be seen everywhere, blended in beautifully with the other eras that came before. Glorious buildings. There's the newly built York Assembly Rooms. You've got the Judge's Lodging, now an inn. You have the new Mansion House. But look at the shambles. It's now looking pretty much as it does today. Shop fronts are getting refitted. Long gone are the old butcher shops. It's a new era. And all written about in the new newspaper, the York Mercury, that was established. So much is changing around this period, especially architecture, as the old Baroque style was giving way to the neoclassical. And as George I passed the torch down to George II, York Minster had some minor restoration, mainly the floor, redone in marble. There's even a hospital built, although it's not without its unsavoury characters, like John Palmer. He's arrested in 1738. John Palmer is a local butcher and a horse trader who enjoys hunting with the local gentry. Pretty much a nobody who lodges at the Ferry Inn in his riding. He's in trouble for shooting some guy's cock. Jesus, you lot, you'll get me into trouble. Cock, rooster, male chicken. Back in those days, people would have cockfights. Oi! Cockfights which involved gambling. And John Palmer had just shot one with a flintlock pistol, which he shouldn't have had in the first place. He then threatens to shoot the chap whose cock it was. So Palmer is now in front of the courts, and will most likely spend some time in the House of Corrections. Basically, an 18th century slap on the wrist. But it escalates when he's accused of horse theft, which is a capital crime. And then it gets even worse from there. When looking into Palmer's history, the judges trace him back to Lincolnshire, where he's wanted for stealing sheep. It turns out he's been a proper naughty boy. The three judges, curious by what's unfolding, decide to have him rearrested and moved from the House of Corrections into the prison at York Castle. He's now in deep trouble. And boy, it's about to escalate even further. It's about to get a lot worse. They are about to learn that he's not from the north at all. He's an Essex boy. He's the famous highwayman, known as Dick Turpin. Dick Turpin isn't your charming gentleman highwayman like Swift Nick. He's a ruthless rogue. He's the head of a nasty bunch of characters called the Essex Gang, and they have a long history with the law. They've robbed, they've killed. A very dangerous gang. Some have already swung from the gallows at Tyburn in London. The gang had been broken by law enforcement by this time, and various members were in hiding around the country trying to avoid punishment in a day and age before modern policing. Turpin had made his way up north, and when his crimes got him into trouble, he up and left, each time, changing his name. He's a wily git. So, to put this in perspective, the three judges in York who were overseeing a case about a chap shooting a cock may have been the leader of the most notorious gang in this period. He's only up the road in their prison. That's like discovering the chap you've nicked for a misdemeanour is Reggie Cray. If only they could prove it, he'd be hanged at Knavesmire. But this John Palmer guy wasn't giving them anything. And a quick thing, by the way, about Knavesmire. These days, it's the location of the York racecourse. The first races being in 1731. So, at the time the races were still going on with the racetrack, the area was still being used as a place of execution. A funny old world. Back to Dick. Even the best can make mistakes. And that mistake came when John Palmer sent a letter to a chap in Essex, a man named Rivenall. Having no cash, he's in prison, he decided that the recipient of the letter would pay the charges, the postal charges. A bugger was, Rivenall didn't know who John Palmer was, and refused to pay the charges, claiming he knew no one all the way up in York. So the letter sat around at the postal office in Saffron Walden, Essex. Rivenall was the brother-in-law of Dick Turpin, and lived in a pretty close-knit community. You know, the kind of community where everyone knows each other. In fact, one of Turpin's old school friends, James Smith, worked in the very postal office where a certain letter now resided. It was James Smith who had taught Dick Turpin how to write in the first place back at school. And John Palmer's handwriting looked suspiciously similar to Dick Turpin's. Smith has an idea. He sends the letter back up north to the judges residing on the case, which is taken up by Sir William Chappell. And now he had enough evidence to convict Dick Turpin of all the crimes he was accused of. He would swing. Once the judge's gavel fell, Dick Turpin was sent to Knavesmire, where he was hanged by the neck on the scaffold until dead. Hanging back then, by the way, doesn't use the Victorian method, the later method, where the fall breaks your neck, instantaneous. Oh no, this is the short drop, causing you to die by strangulation as you're just hanging there. Meaning you wriggled around as you were slowly killed, your legs kicking about. Hence, you danced the Tyburn jig. And Turpin had danced his last jig. Hours later, his body was eventually cut down and taken to a local pub, known now as the Blue Boar. And there he was pretty much put on display in the cellar until his burial came round. Of the 18th century, though, all the inventions, architecture, innovations, the philosophy, you got some of the best minds. And it's all famous for pirates and flipping highwaymen. Oh, and a mad king, who incidentally inherits the throne in 1760. Around this time, I'll just do a brief mention that the British Empire is the largest empire that's existed at this point in time. It controls most of the world in one way or another. Canada, America, you name it. Though we can't hold it in its state for too long. And soon, the 13 colonies in America break off from the empire. And this will affect the king's health dramatically. Now, this is the famous War of Independence, led by a man called George Washington, who'd become the first president of the newly formed United States of America. But it's not from York, so let's head back over the Atlantic, back to dear old Blighty, to continue the tour of history. Have you ever had a Terry's chocolate orange? Well, it all starts here in York, because in 1767, a chap named Robert Berry opens a small candy shop in Bootham Bar. The actual story of Terry's chocolate won't start proper until the 19th century, but its origins begin here, at a small shop in York. As I stated before, everything is changing. The Georgian Era made a huge impact on the city. So much architecture comes from this era. But it's not just about the architecture. Because York is also the home to Edward Pigott, an astronomer whose father built him his own observatory. He specialises in variable stars. That is, stars whose brightness change with time. In 1784, he informs the Royal Society in London that he's discovered Eta Aquilinae. He's quite the astronomer. And his neighbour also has a growing interest in the field. He's a Dutch teenager by the name of John Goodrich. Unfortunately, he's deaf. And after attending a school for the deaf, he has returned to his parents who live in York. The year before, he'd been at Pigott's observatory and discovered a new star and presented it to the Royal Society of London in 1783. It's a binary star known as Agel and is awarded the Copley Medal. And before long, this young astronomer is exploring the Delta Cephei with his friend Pigott. But unfortunately, poor Goodrich fell ill of pneumonia in 1786 and passed away at only 21 years of age. He'd just been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, an honour he never got to learn of. If any people out there from the US, or anywhere really, have heard of the Goodrich-Pigott Observatory in Arizona, it's named after these two chaps, and the later, Pigott, eventually moved out of York to Bath in the West Country. But talking of illness, King George is suffering his famous bouts of mental illness around now, and his son, Prince George, is elected to stand in as regent, as the king cannot possibly run the kingdom. You've got Napoleon on the rise following the French Revolution, and Europe was pretty much at war, preventing his conquests, or trying. George IV now succeeds the throne. giving way to a new age. Soon York would become part of the Industrial Revolution that would change the face of the planet. Yorkshire in general is already a part of this, a huge part of this, and coal is the mineral of the era. Deep pits providing work in places like Leeds and Doncaster, while textile factories are everywhere, steelworks, fishing in places like Whitby. And soon a new queen would rule over this vast empire that spans from Canada to India. We're entering the Victorian era, and we'll be exploring that next time.